What if I told you that you are contributing to the Earth's destruction? Or just by driving over here or doing something as simple as turning on a light bulb, that you've increased the likelihood of a terror attack on America? Well, this sounds like some wild conspiracy theory. You may know it under the name of global warming. Some scientists say that it's gotten to the point where mankind has the power to affect the world as a whole. And since we all know from Spider-Man that with great power comes great responsibility, the fate of the world is in your hands. Over the years, people have given vent to some very dire predictions concerning the future of the world. These range from the Earth turning into a watery wasteland to increased natural disasters, and we've all seen the pictures of a starving polar bear desperately clinging to a minuscule iceberg, a victim of melting ice. So is it true what the Pope, National Geographic, and so many others are saying? Today I'll be discussing the facts and knowledge behind global warming. Global warming has been a hot topic for some time now. However, before we go into the specifics, let's take a quick overview at the actual theory of global warming. First of all, the sun emits heat in the form of solar radiation. When this hits the Earth, about half of it is reflected back in the form of infrared radiation. However, not all of that reaches space. About half of it is stopped in the atmosphere by the greenhouse gases and by CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is what has been known as the greenhouse effect. Without this effect, the Earth would be around on average 0 degrees in Fahrenheit. However, the global warming theory is not all about the natural cycle. It's about the level of CO2 added by humans. But to truly understand this theory, you have to understand that CO2 is only a very minor part of the atmosphere. In fact, CO2 is only 10% of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Let's take an example, for instance. If the atmosphere is represented by a full-size Eiffel Tower, the amount of CO2 in this atmosphere would only be around 3.4 inches. And the levels of CO2 added by humans of today would only be around 1.5 inches. The percentage of CO2 is so small that CO2 alone can do little to affect the Earth's climate. However, according to the global warming theory, CO2 warms the atmosphere enough to allow water vapor to enter the atmosphere, which in turn warms the Earth up more. So the global warming theory goes something like CO2 warms up CO2 added by humans set off a chain reaction, which in turn dangerously heats up the Earth's climate. In theory, the global warming seems plausible. However, global warming still is just that, a theory. Let's take a look at whether this theory has some substantial proof to back it up. One of the main arguments often cited by the liberal media is that for the last 2,000 years, temperature graphs seem to show levels of CO2 rising and falling along with the Earth's temperature. This seems to show that CO2 controls the Earth's climate. However, a closer study of the facts showed that the levels of CO2 actually lag behind the levels of temperature. Instead of CO2 causing the variations in temperature, the changes in temperature actually cause the variations in CO2. Have you ever noticed that when you refrigerate soda, it stays carbonated longer? Well, the reason why this is that carbon dioxide dissolves in water easier at lower temperatures. The same thing goes with the ocean. When atmospheric temperatures are down, the levels of CO2 that can dissolve in the ocean CO2 can dissolve in the ocean easier. Therefore, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere also go down. So, if CO2 isn't the culprit, then what is? Well, the main driver for climate change on the Earth is actually the conditions of the sun. Many scientists correlate the conditions of sunspots and solar flares with the Earth's climate. This was observed during a time known as the modern minimum, when sunspots and solar flares were exceedingly rare and the Earth's temperature overall was cooler. When we look at graphs of temperature and solar cycles, we can see an almost direct correlation. So what happens is that the conditions of the sun affect the Earth's climate, and that in turn affects the levels of CO2. Now you may be thinking, but why do 97% of climate scientists think you're wrong? Now, if you've ever been in an argument about global warming, you might have heard this argument smugly repeated to you in a very patronizing voice. However, the statistic is only about actively publishing climate scientists. And the statistic in the number 97% was only talking about a study from 240 scientists. What we should really be looking at is what a wide variety of scientists believe. Dr. Art Robinson has maintained a website since 1998, signed by over 20,000 scientists, saying that as of 2009, there is no convincing scientific evidence that CO2, man-made CO2, is causing or will or is causing catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere or disruption of the Earth's climate. Over 2,500 of these are physicists, geophysicists, climatologists, meteorologists, oceanographers, and environmental scientists. So when you say that global warming has yet to be proven, you're not flying in the face of all logic and reason. In fact, many prominent scientists will agree with you. Today, climate change has been blown way out of proportion. Politicians have been basically using global warming to scare America into supporting them. Let's take Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. In his bid for presidency, he has argued that global warming is the biggest national security threat to America, even going so far as to say that there is a direct link between climate change and terrorism. This is a clear attempt to scare up votes. For too long, politicians have been exaggerating global warming to promote their own political agendas. In an article entitled "The Goal is Power: The Global Warming Conspiracy," the Forbes magazine reported that after analyzing emails among lead climate scientists, they found a purposeful and coordinated effort to disguise evidence, suppress facts, and manipulate data. Global warming, as writer George Will points out, has basically become a backdoor to socialism. And while this may seem a little bit extreme, it's actually not too far-fetched, because global warming has become the excuse by which the government rationalizes more and more power to itself. So why does this matter? Well, it doesn't matter because if you don't stop driving your car immediately, there'll be more droughts, hurricanes, or floods. The real issue comes from our own government. Despite the fact that there are many arguments for both sides, the government is on the verge of passing regulations proposed by the Environmental Agency that would regulate the amount of CO2 power plants are allowed to output. This plan would cause us to go green in more ways than one. First of all, power plants would immediately have to invest in ways to cut down carbon emissions. Resultingly, the cost of power would skyrocket. Also, this could have some very detrimental effects on our economy. According to the Heritage Foundation's Global Index model, our economy, as a result of these regulations, could lose over $7 trillion in product losses. Our GDP could lose over $600 billion, and America could lose over 800,000 jobs in just 1 year. Some industries losing over 50% of its available jobs. You see, this isn't a matter of sacrificing a few jobs for the sake of a planet. It's more like sacrificing our economy for the sake of a theory. You see, there is a problem with global warming, but it's not because man is putting out too much CO2. The real issue is that our government is treating it like a fact. Through all the hype, we need to apply 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things and hold fast to what is good. And we've seen that the global warming theory does not really hold up to the test of facts. But of course, there will always be a number of people who will tell you that it does. And maybe they're right. But until we have definite proof, do we really want our economy to lose $7 trillion in product losses or electricity prices to skyrocket? Politicians and media all conveniently leave out these key details so that people remain uninformed. Now, many of us aren't politicians, but we the people have the power to take a stand against global warming. Proverbs 18:21 tells us that death and life are in the power of the tongue. We can tell people about the facts and write letters to our representatives and senators. I urge you to utilize that power. And since we all know from Spider-Man that with great power comes great responsibility, the fate of the world is in your hands.